How's it going, you guys? So in this video, I'm going to be discussing the pros and cons of carbohydrates. So I've done a number of experiments over the years with my own diet, and I've counseled a number of different people on their own diets as well. Study the medical literature, the literature on nutrition and health, health science, and I've been nose deep in that for well over 6 years now. Most of the people that follow me on my channel, they follow me because of all of my nutritional experiments and supplement experiments that I've done. And so my deep fascination and passion for this subject has led me to studying the experiences of thousands and thousands of people. And I've been able to see a wide range of pros and cons, and been able to measure it up to the scientific literature and measure its validity based on all of these factors. So, first of all, let's start with the pros, okay? So, realize that a lot of this is context dependent, and there's a reason why I'm making a video about the pros and cons of carbs. Like, most people just assume that carbs are neutral or carbs are good or that you need carbs, but most of these statements are false, and for the most part, people are very misinformed. So the pros of carbohydrates. So many carbohydrate foods are very high in minerals, okay, magnesium, potassium, etc., etc., okay? And these minerals can be difficult for a lot of people to get in their diet. Now, mind you, magnesium and potassium is actually found in adequate amounts in lean muscle tissue. So people who are eating lean meats or, lots of meat in general will generally get plenty of magnesium and potassium. But most people are not eating enough animal protein, in my opinion. And so they're not getting enough magnesium and potassium from these foods. And even if they did eat a lot of the animal proteins, they're not eating the drippings, which is where most of these mineral content actually resides. But nonetheless, potatoes, even things like beans. Okay, so there's anti-nutrients, which we'll discuss in the cons, but there's also ways around that. And cooking largely destroys a decent amount of the phytic acid and the anti-nutrient content, but there's other ways that you can neutralize it even further. Bananas, blueberries, fruits, tubers. In my opinion, fruits and tubers are probably the safest source for most people, but you can get magnesium and potassium and all of these minerals in many carbohydrate foods. Also, some nutrients like iodine can be found, but it depends on the soil. It largely depends on the soil. Another benefit is the retention of minerals from a higher carbohydrate intake. So a lot of people don't know this, but when you maintain a moderate to high intake of carbohydrates, your body is more adept to storing water as well as retaining minerals within that water. And this is why a lot of times people on low carb diets, they tend to require a large amount of sodium intake, and they have to constantly make sure they're getting enough electrolytes. Is because when you lower carbohydrates, your body starts to dump excess water, which can successfully treat high blood pressure. And it actually has been shown in intervention trials that low carb diets actually produce a significant, like 3 times the reduction in blood pressure compared to the Ornish vegetarian low fat diet. But that's actually one of the pros of carbohydrates, is that for healthy people, especially if you're an athlete, you're sweating constantly. Maintaining hydration for many people is hard enough because a lot of people drink a lot of water, but the minerals within that water is what matters. And sometimes it's actually easy to get hyponatremia, and that's a whole nother video to make, but essentially you can have symptoms of hyponatremia despite having sodium levels within healthy range. And so a lot of people think that they are fine on sodium and minerals, but they're suffering hyponatremia. It's just not appearing in blood tests because the criteria for such a diagnosis is inadequate. But higher carbohydrate intake helps to offset some of the mineral loss that can happen in sweat and things like that. Anywhere from 4 to 10 pounds worth of water weight is dictated by your carbohydrate intake. Okay, so that is a pro of carbohydrates, is that your body is much more efficient at storing water and retaining minerals. Now, if you're eating whole carbohydrate foods, then you will be getting minerals in that food, as long as you're able to manage the anti-nutrient content, which again is a very complicated topic. So let's see. So, I mean, for the most part, in my opinion, those are the main benefits of carbohydrate foods, of having a higher carbohydrate intake or eating higher carbohydrate foods, is that if you're eating whole carbohydrate foods, you're getting a large amount of minerals, and your body is going to be able to retain those minerals with a higher carbohydrate intake. Now, as far as sports performance is concerned, me myself, I competed in a Muay Thai exhibition match after 9 months on the ketogenic diet, and I was able to keep up a much higher intensity throughout the whole match than my opponent, who was, I munched out on, about a half a pound of pepperoni a couple hours before my match, whereas my opponent was munching out on fruit leading up to the match. And he did a couple combos, once every 30 seconds or so, whereas the whole time I was bouncing around, lots of footwork, kicking, striking, combos, jumping. So, my point here is that I've been able to maintain a high amount of performance without carbohydrate intake. But the key here is that I've also been able to maintain a high sodium intake, as well as minding my potassium and magnesium. So again, this goes back to minerals, and it's why I don't consider refilling glycogen as a benefit of a high carbohydrate diet. So, and the reason why is, number one, the science, because people don't understand gluconeogenesis. Gluconeogenesis is the man-driven process where basically when you restrict carbohydrates, if your body senses a demand for glycogen, for example, like if you do hardcore exercise, your body will actually convert its own body fat into glycogen. So preferentially, gluconeogenesis converts free fatty acids and the glycerol backbone of triglycerides. So both forms of fat, that's the primary source of glucose and glycogen on a ketogenic metabolism. And also keep in mind that even people who are calorically restricting and they're eating like 150 grams of carbs a day, to a certain extent, they are producing a small amount of glucose or glycogen from gluconeogenesis at certain parts of the day, especially after workouts. And also having a moderate, they're producing a minor state of ketosis, small amount of ketones post-workout on a caloric restricted diet. So, most people, they don't actually understand the science. Even ketogenic diet promoters, keto gurus and keto doctors, they don't actually understand it. Only recently have people been waking up to the fact that your body can actually convert free fatty acids and the glycerol backbone of triglycerides into glycogen and glucose. So with that being said, you don't need carbohydrates to refill glycogen. And if you look at the FASTER study by Stephen Finney and Jeff Follock, they found that an elite marathon athletes, okay, so I know these are marathon athletes, but still, they still burn glycogen in their sport. What they found is those who were keto adapted long before they even went into experiments. This is more of a cohort trial, but it's an intervention trial nonetheless. The keto adapted athletes compared to the high carb athletes, the keto adapted athletes performed as good or better than the ones adapted to a high carbohydrate intake on an hour-long high-intensity bicycle ride or what have you, on a stationary bike. And the keto adapted athletes actually refilled glycogen faster than the high carb intake athletes. So they measured glycogen stores with muscle biopsies, if I remember correctly. And they found that the keto adapted elite athletes, elite marathoners, refill glycogen faster. Okay? And they outperformed or performed just as good as the ones who were adapted to a carbohydrate intake. So I know that that's marathon, athletes, and it's commonly thought that, that you can only run on fat during like endurance races and stuff like that, but not during glycotic exercises. But nonetheless, it's been conducive to my own experience, where essentially I've been able to maintain a high level of performance in powerlifting, Olympic lifting, MMA, and Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu with a low carbohydrate intake. And what I found is, because I've tried carbohydrate experiments, I've tried targeted keto, where I take 20 grams of dextrose before workout. I've tried cyclic keto, where I do 1 day of high carbs. I've also tried, 1 to 3 weeks of high carb intake, where I'm eating 100 to 200 grams of carbs from fruit and rice, where I was definitely not in ketosis during that time. And I found carbohydrate intake at times seems to actually lower my performance, where I feel more sluggish. It's harder for me to recover. My joints start to hurt worse. And I don't experience any benefit as far as explosiveness, power, endurance, ability to recover. I find all my attributes are amplified when I'm on a ketogenic metabolism. So that leads me to believe that there's very little benefits in carbohydrate intake for athletic performance. But I have found that if I benefit at all from carbohydrates, it would be 20 grams of dextrose before workout, but only every now and then. And I don't really even see that as necessary. I think taking 20 grams of dextrose before workout gives me a mental high, like a sugar rush in a way, where I feel less mental fatigue. But I think that that's more of the effects of sugar rather than, it's the effects of a drug, basically, rather than, it benefiting my performance, like actually. So, anyway, carbohydrates are not, they don't really seem to provide much of a benefit for athletic endeavor, except for, number one, if people just don't want to remove carbohydrates from their diet, then they're going to have a high carb intake to make up for the lack of caloric energy and to continuously fuel their body, which I think is just so inefficient. Yeah, and then retaining minerals and retaining hydration. I mean, this is a really hard thing to put out on video, because I know the majority of people that will be watching this are brainwashed into thinking that they need carbs, and they don't even want, because they've been told over and over again, because no one studies keto adapted humans. It's very understudied. So everything we know is about people who eat carbs. Even the so-called low carbohydrate studies, they're done on people who eat 100 grams of carbs a day. 70 grams of carbs or more is really not low carb when we're talking about ketogenic metabolism. If you're eating over 50 grams of carbs a day, your body is going to starve without adequate carbohydrates. But if you're eating, under 30 grams of net carbs per day, after 4 weeks, you will adapt. and you'll experience benefits beyond anything you've ever felt with carbohydrates if you are consuming enough minerals. Most people, they feel like crap on low carb or keto because they don't eat enough minerals, they don't eat enough protein, and so of course they're going to feel like crap. And then when they eat carbs, lo and behold, they feel better. Well, guess why? It's because your body is starting to retain water and minerals again. Anyway, so let's talk about the cons here now. So some of the cons of carbohydrates. Oh, and another pro of carbohydrates, which I should have gotten out before, is that a lot of carbohydrate foods do contain polyphenols. Now, it's a mixed bag with polyphenols. So people overgeneralize polyphenols as universally good. But the fact is, some polyphenols can benefit the body, others can harm the body, and some work like drugs. Like, for example, curcumin seems to work more like an anti-inflammatory drug, which, if used in excess, could possibly have diminishing returns and negative side effects. But at the same time, certain polyphenols, like some of the ones in blueberries, what is it, the anthocyanins or what have you, the blue pigments, purple pigments, actually seem to have cognitive benefits like increasing brain-derived neurotrophic factor and things of that nature. Some of the polyphenols in green tea, for example, increase neurogenesis, brain-derived neurotrophic factor, and produce mental states that are conducive to improved cognitive function. But that is not a benefit of carbohydrates per se, but more so some of the compounds found in some higher carbohydrate foods. But they're not necessary to survive, and for many people, a lot of these foods cause more harm than good. So so let's start with the cons now. So we have fiber, all right? So most people think that they need fiber for intestinal health, and that's just ridiculous. So first of all, people who eat a 100% all meat carnivore diet, they don't experience, and so when you first start, of course, it takes some time to adapt. And if you're eating too much fat, then you might have diarrhea. But for me, for example, once every morning, I just take a giant excretion, let's put it that way. And it's the healthiest poop I've ever taken in my life, right? When I start to consume fibrous plant foods, it's inconsistent. Sometimes I'll be constipated, other times I'll see undigested plants in my stool. And then after a while, it'll balance out and it'll just look like a bigger version of what I get on the carnivore diet. So, the definition of fiber is indigestible matter. And essentially, most plants contain a large amount of indigestible plant matter. And the reason why is because human beings do not, for one, we can't convert cellulose into short-chain fatty acids. Maybe our gut can produce some of that to butyrate, but we don't really need to even produce butyrate in the intestine anyway, because we can, ketones they essentially provide butyrate. And we can eat fats directly that contain butyrate. Butter has butyrate, for example, butyric acid. But you don't need fiber to maintain regular bowel movements, and all of the studies that say, greater fiber intake correlates with less risk of cancer and less cholesterol and all this, none of those studies actually show a direct causal link between fiber and improved health outcomes. They're correlations. So people who eat more fiber have better health, okay? It's so funny how people don't understand what the fuck that means. And it's irritating. It's irritating because it should be so obvious. People who eat more fiber have better health outcomes. So who are these people who eat more fiber, huh? Who actually invests more money in fibrous plant foods, for example? People who eat more green vegetables, huh? Who's going to spend, how much is it for a pound of spinach? For fresh spinach, it's like $6 a pound for fresh, green spinach. Who's going to pay that much money? That's a lot of money to be paying for vegetables, and then their broccoli and all this. Most people who invest that much money in vegetables, they do so because they believe it's healthy. And so those are actually, people who engage in a lot of healthy practices. They actually probably avoid the things that they believe are unhealthy, and they avoid the things that they believe are unhealthy, and they try to do more things that they believe are healthy. So it's the healthy user bias. As far as I'm aware, there's no intervention trials that show decreased risk of colon cancer, decreased risk of heart disease, and blah, blah, blah by eating fiber. And a lot of it is what they replace. Like, the majority of those people who eat the lowest amounts of fiber in these diets, they have a high sugar intake, they eat a lot of unhealthy foods, most likely. Because everything that human beings believe, or that societies, Americans, whatever, believe is healthy, has high amounts of fiber. The government, when they tell people who want to be healthy what is healthy, they say, eat 30 grams of fiber minimum, eat whole grains, eat fruits and vegetables. So of course, everybody who's trying to be healthy, by association, are going to have higher fiber intakes. But that doesn't mean that it's the fiber that's causing the greater health outcomes. So this is why correlation does not equal causation, and you should not, you should take all of these cohort studies, population studies, etc., with a grain of salt. Okay. And the same thing can be said about studies linking red meat to cancer and linking red meat to all these negative health outcomes. Is because, most people who eat more red meat, they don't really care about the government's recommendations. And so these are generally the people who participate in a large amount of unhealthy habits. Okay. So and then we got the idea of the gut microbiome. Like, do we really need to eat fiber and plant foods so that we have like a healthy gut microbiome? So healthy gut microbiome is an illusion, okay? Let me explain why. So first of all, the majority of the studies on gut microbiome, they show an association between certain types of bacteria and greater health outcomes. But from what I can see, so first of all, there are no intervention trials that the closest thing you have to a causal link between gut microbiome and health would be they took fecal matter out of a group of rats with autism, and then they implanted that fecal matter into a healthy group of rats and triggered autistic syndrome symptoms in them. So it seems like we can take poop from one organism's colon and put it in another and cause health problems. Although that's very shaky science. As far as I know, it's mostly done on rats. And I don't know if it's because they started eating more foods that cause those symptoms, or I'm not sure how all that works. But studies like that are extremely rare, and I don't know if it really translates into human experience. But most of these studies are correlating strains of bacteria and a person's intestine to the health outcomes that they receive. So here's the problem with that. The problem is that when you eat broccoli, for example, most of the carbohydrates and the fibers in broccoli are digested by bacteria in the intestine. In fact, most plant foods, they're just chewed up. They're just how you chew them is how they're going to appear in the stomach. Like, they don't actually digest until they hit the intestine. And so most plant foods are almost entirely digested by the intestine, okay, other than the amylase in your saliva. And so they're digested by bacteria in the intestine. So each plant food feeds a certain bacteria in the intestine, because that bacteria in your intestine is what digests it. So when you eat broccoli, you're going to produce the type of bacteria that digests broccoli. When you eat bananas, you're going to feed the type of bacteria that eats bananas, okay? And so the point here is the types of bacteria in people's intestine are simply a reflection of the types of foods they're eating. And so if you have, you know, lactobacillus, people who have the most lactobacillus in their intestine have the least amount of heart disease. It's literally the same healthy user bias as the studies that correlate high fiber intake with greater health outcomes. It is absolutely not a causal factor. It's not like, oh, like, you know, he has a high amount of, you know, lactobacillus in his intestine, and that lactobacillus is creating more serotonin, which is causing less depression and blah, blah, blah. It's the type of foods these people are eating that are creating that bacteria. And those bacteria can be measured with ubiome tests and things like that. But it's entirely, again, healthy user bias, because the people who eat healthy foods are going to have the bacteria that digest those foods in their intestine. And it's the overall healthy lifestyle that these people who eat so-called healthy foods are engaging in that's creating the health outcomes. More exercise, less hydrogenated oils, less highly inflammatory omega-6 polyunsaturated fats, less refined flours, less sugar, okay? And so if they correlate certain bacteria that digest sugar, that digest refined sugar, for example, or things like candida, etc., they correlate that with worse health outcomes. A lot of that has to do with the whole spectrum of negative effects that's associated with sugar intake and refined flour intake. And it has very little to do with the actual bacteria itself. It's what foods are these people eating that feeds that bacteria, and then what types of people eat those foods. It's healthy user bias again. And also, they've done studies on people who eat zero carbohydrates at all, and they actually have a greater diversity of gut bacteria than people who eat the most plant foods or the most carbohydrates. Another thing is your environment also has a heavier influence on your microbiome than the foods that you eat. So just me walking out here, you know, on these rocks down here or whatever is going to shape my microbiome. Working with animals is going to shape your microbiome. Your microbiome is extremely dynamic, extremely complex, and there's not any causal evidence to support the fact that you need, I need plant foods or I need carbohydrate foods in order to feed a healthy microbiome. There's no such thing as a healthy microbiome. It's just this idea people have, this concept that's based on correlation. You know, there's no like real good solid evidence that you need to eat carbohydrates or any food to get certain bacteria in your gut. A lot of this is just fuel for the supplement industry. You know how many people are releasing prebiotic and probiotic foods? Like, it's crazy, man. It's crazy. And of course, some people might find that some probiotics might help irritable bowel syndrome symptoms and stuff like that, but it's very shaky, it's not consistent, and a lot of people, like, it seems like maybe 3 out of 10 people seem to experience benefits. So there's a lot of stuff to talk about in regards to the gut microbiome, but I can tell you for sure, I strongly am pretty confident that you don't need to be like buying plant foods for your microbiome, okay? For mineral content, sure. For specific polyphenol content, sure. So now we're going to move on to the most important con of all, which would be that a lot of people cannot tolerate certain carbohydrate foods. So the most common foods that people have trouble with are things like beans, okay? We all know that dumbass song, beans, beans, blah, 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 blah. Look, the reason why is because it contains certain fibers and carbohydrates that are hard for most people to break down. Another part of that is that people don't properly soak and sprout their beans. So beans are technically a seed, technically. And most seeds, they don't want to be eaten, okay? So you generally will eat a fruit, and the seeds you're supposed to poop out whole so that you can actually fertilize the seed in the ground along with your manure, which is your crap. That's literally how nature has created fruits. That's the whole purpose of them. That's why you have a sugar craving. However, so you're not supposed to digest them. So traditional cultures who eat the most of these foods actually have long processes that they use to neutralize the phytic acid and make these foods easier to digest. And so things like, soaking, sprouting, cooking and pulverizing, pressure cooking, drying, etc., etc. These processes make these foods easier to digest. And a lot of people experience irritable bowel syndrome, bloating, undigested food in the stool, colitis, Crohn's disease from, for one, refined carbohydrates and refined sugar. But for two, the fiber and these whole carbohydrates themselves actually irritate the intestine. And there's actually studies that show, for one, there's a dose-dependent response, and the least amount of fiber that you eat and symptoms of, I think it was tuberculosis. There's an intervention trial where they actually compared different fiber intakes, and they found when people remove fiber from the diet completely, symptoms of constipation go away completely, and there's a dose-dependent response on the amount of fiber these people eat and symptoms of constipation, which was defined as the feeling of needing to take a bowel movement but not being able to. And so, and you could find this if you search it up. But yeah, I mean. And then you look at people who don't eat fiber, right? So a lot of people, when they go on an autoimmune paleo diet, for example, so they're changing the types of carbs they're eating. They're no longer eating whole grains, beans, nuts and seeds, and now they're eating tubers and fruits, or just fruits. And there's different types of fibers, different types of carbs, and typically those are easier to tolerate, easier to digest and break down for most people. And a lot of people experience remission in Crohn's, colitis, and intestinal disorders. I myself completely cured myself of irritable bowel syndrome by doing this. A lot of people do. Now, some people take it a step further and they go on an all red meat diet and they experience complete remission of these diseases. Now, mind you, there's this huge push for removing red meat from the diet because they claim that's inflammatory and it feeds putrefying bacteria and amino acids in the gut and blah blah blah. But we don't see that in people that actually remove carbs and eat nothing but red meat. So I'm not saying that that's what you should do. What I'm saying here is that a lot of people have food intolerances that make these high carb foods that most people eat, brown rice, you name it, problematic. And so for a lot of people, lowering their carbohydrate intake or removing these plant foods in general, going on elimination diets and things like that tend to provide relief. And it's crazy to me that the exact foods that doctors recommend their patients to eat tend to be causing a lot of the problems that people deal with. And I think that's just a lack of proper information and misunderstanding. There are a lot of cons to carbohydrate foods, and I think the main reason why I don't have a lot of pros for carbohydrate foods is because they're just not necessary. Like, if there was a biological requirement for carbohydrates, then that would be a different story. And then there's the repeat diet people who say that carbohydrate is needed and required for thyroid function. That's not true at all. So here's the thing. So Tim Noakes, I believe, actually published a paper in 2019 where he showed that it's not the carbohydrate intake of low-carb diets that cause adaptive thermogenesis, okay? But it's low-calorie diets in general. So here's the thing. So the reason why a lot of people on low-carb diets some women might notice their period goes away, some men might notice lower testosterone, some people might find a dip in thyroid function. So the main reason here is that low carb diets promote satiety. So for one, producing ketones in general, it has an appetite suppressant effect because your body's literally eating its own body fat for caloric energy. So there's no requirement for external energy other than protein. Second thing is that protein and fat are both the most satiating macronutrients that there are. And some doctors debate whether it's protein or fat that is more satiating. But the fact is they're both highly satiating. In fact, I've actually eaten a half a pound of suet one time, which is just pure beef fat. And man, I actually was not hungry for 4 days. And that was not healthy, but in my opinion at least. Nonetheless, it's highly satiating. And so what happens is people naturally will undereat calories on these low carb diets or these keto diets. And so when you have a low calorie intake, over time you create what's known as adaptive thermogenesis. And what that is the body lowers its energy expenditure, its caloric expenditure. It lowers its body temperature, lowers thyroid hormone in order to prevent the requirement for breaking down more body tissue to provide energy. So that the body can survive longer, it lowers its energy expenditure. So you don't need as much calories to sustain basic metabolic function because it lowers the metabolic rate. Okay, so that's adaptive thermogenesis. The thing is, that happens on any diet where you lower caloric intake. And what you find is that, so that's why like prolonged caloric deficits, generally people feel like crap and they do notice a dip in testosterone. And so what you find is that when people start to add more fat in the diet and more calories, the testosterone levels go up. Like there was this guy named Carnivore Kurt on YouTube, for example, who demonstrated exactly this with blood tests. And you can actually get your thyroid up and functioning again, and hormones start to go back to healthy ranges because you're actually feeding your body the caloric energy that it needs to where it doesn't need to lower its thyroid hormone to lower caloric expenditure to preserve muscle tissue and things like that. So the point here is it's not carbohydrates that is responsible for that. It's caloric energy in general. Even on a mostly like if you look at Freely the Banana Girl, like she lost her period on that all banana diet and she was eating enough bananas, right? Which is what repeat people generally recommend is high fruit intake. Of course, that's probably still a dumb example, but you see the same thing happen in people who eat higher carb, calorically restricted diets. So, so I just don't believe that. And the other thing is that there's a relationship between carbohydrate metabolism itself requiring certain ratios of thyroid hormone. And so it might also just be the result of a less requirement for thyroid hormone in general to sustain health because of the lower carbohydrate intake. But that I have not researched deep enough into because I believe the adaptive thermogenesis theory in caloric intake rather than carbohydrate intake, I believe that theory is much more valid. So yeah, again, overall, like if you enjoy carbohydrates, just stick to the whole carbohydrate foods that don't irritate your body. I mean, there's nothing wrong with that, but at the same time, don't be scared if you're not reaching your carbohydrate goal for the brain. I mean, because the brain, for one, can survive on glucose generated from free fatty acids from gluconeogenesis, and also ketones. The body can sustain life without carbohydrates for your entire life, actually. Look at Alexander the Bear Stanley, who lived on an all-meat diet for over 50 years and died at 76 from a car accident. Look at the Inuit, the Maasai tribe, before they started eating cornmeal and stuff like that. Um, Look at the majority of these carnivore dieters that are lasting, decades, and then look at me, who I've been eating mostly ketogenic and carnivore for a year and a half now, over a year and a half. It's going to be 2 years in December, and I'm an athlete for crying out loud. If I need carbohydrates to survive, like, I have actually experienced the exact opposite so far. I've experienced nothing but benefits. So, of course, that's another con of carbohydrate intake, is that it prevents you from entering ketosis. And ketosis is anti-inflammatory through multiple mechanisms. Okay, so for one, you have less reactive oxygen species as a byproduct of less carbohydrate metabolism. So burning fat for fuel and creating your energy endogenously actually produces less inflammation and less reactive oxygen species in general. The second thing is that ketones, beta-hydroxybutyrate, is anti-inflammatory. And that's one of the reasons why it provides a wide scope of benefits for many neurodegenerative diseases. The other one is that when you're in ketosis, the body actually has a more efficient conversion of glutamate into GABA. So more GABA means less stress and less neurotoxicity. And less stress, you could also say, indirectly contributes to less inflammation. The other thing is muscle protein synthesis is enhanced through multiple direct and indirect mechanisms. So one of them is that ketogenic diets, so beta-hydroxybutyrate actually upregulates protein synthesis. There's a greater recycling of leucine, which upregulates protein synthesis. And it seems to also improve the recycling of BCAAs in the plasma, or in the serum, in the blood. Okay. And also, there's also various other mechanisms of muscle sparing, protein sparing, and amino acid sparing through ketosis. So when you consider all the benefits of a ketogenic metabolism and the lack of a need for carbohydrate foods or even fiber, for me, I just can't help but question, what exactly is the purpose of eating carbohydrates other than to fulfill like a sweet tooth or something of that nature, like a craving. Which, by the way, I don't get carbohydrate cravings after a couple days in ketosis, or really at all anymore, even when I have eaten carbohydrates, unless I'm eating a large amount of sugar. So yeah, leave your question and comments down below, and if you actually watch this entire video all the way through, I congratulate you. It's 43 minutes of me just going on and on. Please let me know down in the comments if you watched the whole video, please, and I appreciate you guys. Let me know your experiences, and let me know if you eat carbs, why? Why do you eat carbs? Let me know what you think, and I won't judge you. I just want to know. I'm curious. And if you don't eat carbs, let me know why. I'll tell you why I don't eat carbs, because they generally cause lethargy, brain fog, sluggishness. They make it harder for me to sleep, joint pain. It's harder for me to recover from exercise. I seem to lose stamina, endurance, and power during training. It's pretty crazy, actually. But let me know, why do you eat carbs, or why don't you?